I'm bright enough.
Wish I could say that.
Let's roll it, Howard.
I'm on.
Yeah.
Welcome again to our how to study the Bible. This is our third session. I think I said something last week about doing parables this week. I didn't mean that, or rather, if I did, I wanted to change it to we're going to dive into the epistles this week, which invariably draw questions. We had an astute sister send me a note saying, well, we've been pretty basic, but she didn't mind going back over the basics. I don't think this evening, we'll find it the basics. I'm anticipating questions both from the audience that's looking at out there in visual land, wherever that is, as well as anybody here in our auditorium. I don't want to imply that I have all the answers. That's not my objective, nor our objective behind making the presentation. What I hope that comes out of this, as we've done every session, is that you study this for yourselves, that you look at it, you don't make assumptions based on what you had been taught necessarily. You take that into consideration, you review the scriptures again, and remember some of the principles we talked about. Then and there, here and now. Don't make an application to yourselves until you looked at the then and there. Because if you do that, then you're suggesting somehow that the scripture has no meaning of then and there, and making the application is extraordinarily difficult because it has a great deal of too many variables that can come in it. So as we dive into this, and we're going to pick some scriptures that tend to be a little bit more difficult, and there's a lot more. There's a whole myriad of scriptures. That doesn't mean we can't get the context. It doesn't mean that we can't study them and understand them. It just suggests that they're not as simple sometimes as we try to make them. And so you really can't short-circuit the methodology of studying the scriptures within its context, that is, within the range of verses that's around it, and jump to an application too quickly. Nor, and I'll make this point through the lecture, nor can you just pull out certain scriptures out of the context and utilize them. The Bible wasn't written that way. It was written to tell us about the story of God. And those who wrote it, and even if you don't believe in God, I said this last week, that's fine. But those who wrote it thought that they were delivering to their audience a story about God. And over that period of time, and there's some 1,500 years in our text from the Old Testament to the book of Revelation, there's some 1,500 years in addition to 40 plus authors that's involved in here. So over that period of time, each one of them had a part, even if they didn't understand entirely how their part was going to fit in with the rest of the text. They understood they were delivering a narrative in relationship to God. The grand story, if you will, of the Bible. It isn't about me, and it isn't about you. Never look at the scriptures in that methodology. Otherwise, everything, and we'll talk about this a little bit, everything will seem as though it can be interpreted however I feel about that thing. I've been studying the scripture for a number of years. I do not feel like I've got all the answers. More importantly, I feel as though I have progressed, and that the me of yesterday is going to have a different understanding of today, because I would hope that I would continue to study and learn and understand languages more effectively, understand the history behind it. I would urge everyone to feel the same way. It isn't about you, it's about the author, his audience, and then the application is to us. That doesn't suggest that the Bible has no meaning. It has a great deal of meaning. But do not make the application until you've done the context, until you've made the effort to go then and there, here and now. We're going to dive into the epistles, as I suggested, the letters in the New Testament. Before I do that, though, I was going to give you a little bit of a cultural aspect. There was an episode in Spain in which the missionary was making an effort to understand the society that he was working around. And he was in a restaurant, and I'm not going to prevail upon myself for as a Spanish, I would try, but he asked for a doggy bag. The waiter very much wanted to help, but he didn't know what he had said, because basically it said he wanted the skin of a dog, and in Spanish. Now, that might, and so the waiter says he didn't know what he wanted. Did he want a bunch of skins from dogs, et cetera, et cetera. The real problem here is that you don't get doggy bags when you're in Europe, or at least not when I was there. You just didn't do that. And it isn't that it's wrong, it's just not something that culturally you would do in Europe, whether you're in Spain or France or any place else. For one thing, at one time, they didn't really have the kind of refrigeration that would be necessary to go along with it. We do that. So we asked for a doggy bag in the U.S. They know what that is, but they didn't there. When we're looking at the scriptures and we're attempting to make an application, we must understand the culture in which it was written. We must make a real effort to do that. Now, you do that with looking, and I suggested this several times, looking at multiple texts of the Bible, one that has a much more formal application, the King James series, and by that I mean New American Standard, any of those that has that range of the King James. They're pulled out of the King James. They're much more formal. They try to translate the Greek manuscripts in the New Testament and Hebrew in the Old Testament into a situation in which the language can be understood in English. By doing that, they may be a little more precise with the language than does a functional text like well, the NIV sort of falls in between, and then you get the Message or Phillips transliteration or several others that might come along. And so I would admonish everybody to try to read, when they're reading the scriptures, to take one from a formal list, and I've gotten the list here, and compare it with one that's more functional. And so to do that. And at the same time, if you're looking at a difficult passage, then dig into a Bible dictionary or even go so far as to get a commentary, although don't do the commentary before you read. You don't need an impression made upon you. Now, the reason we like the New Testament letters is the immediacy aspect of it. We feel as though they're talking to us. And so we grasp that and say, okay, here's the answer that I've been looking for all the difficulties I've had in my life. But we don't bother, rather I shouldn't say that, we don't make the effort to really dive into what the author was trying to tell that culture and that point of time. The letters had another unique situation and what we're a little hard to grasp today. We have all kinds of ways to communicate. The list is more. We got emails, we got texts, we even have handwritten letters if it gets down to it. If you can read my handwriting, it's sort of horrible. I used to send it to Ruth when I was in the Army. She didn't understand what I was saying, but at least she got something from it. We have all of that communication, TVs and everything goes on and on and on. But they were limited in the first century. And so when they wrote a letter, first of all, They didn't write very long, for all the reasons I'm going to enumerate in a moment. Philemon, which is one of our shorter texts in the New Testament, was a lengthy letter than standard, significantly longer than most letters that were written. But in addition to that, the letters invariably came but with a messenger. Why? We didn't have the U.S. Postal Service. There was just, and I ran into this when I was living in Mexico, and Dr. Richard probably did too, and in Costa Rica, etc., Guatemala, wherever he was at in Central America. If you put out a letter into their postal system, you didn't have any confidence that the letter was going to get through. It might not. Well, they had zero confidence in the first century because there was just no way to get a letter effectively done. So it was usually an important letter of any kind was sent with a messenger. What was that messenger supposed to do with that letter? When they arrived, not only were they delivering the letter, they were to read the letter. Why? Because the majority of their people that they were delivering it to probably didn't read so well. In addition to that, they would explain what the author had to say. And so you end up with this kind of personal touch, and the reading of it was done as a group session. We'd be better off if we did much more of our group reading, because we would intermingle with one another about how we understand that when we finish reading. They did, and they had the questions. That's why you look at the Corinthian text, and you get all kinds of questions to Paul when he was writing the Corinthian letter. But it was very expensive to write a letter. We think in terms of, we see Paul has done it about 13 times. The Corinthian letter, Randy Richards, is that who it is? Put out a text about what the letters would cost, etc. in the first century. The Corinthian letter would cost about $2,100 in terms of our money today. That's expensive. That's extraordinarily expensive, because it took usually somebody writing it, if you will, a good scribe. They had to find the material. They just didn't run down and get a bunch of papers and write it down. They had skins to get. They had papyrus to get. If they put it together that way, they had to make their own ink, usually from Greece that was coming out, and a number of other things that would make the ink, and then they would write it. All of that cost money and time. We envision Paul getting heated up in the book of Galatians and writing something, scribbling out, and hurried up and do it, because you get this fire from him when you read the book of Galatians. But he couldn't have done that. He had to think about it. He had to walk around. He had to consider it. It wasn't just ripped off of the computer. We sometimes have a difficulty reaching down and grabbing that. So for all those reasons, we tend to think about it. Now, there's a quote from Dr. Stendhal. You might know him, Richard. Harvard professor. He died a few years ago, but fantastic theologian from Sweden. But he was in charge of a number of moving Harvard forward in terms of its understanding. But our vision is often more abstracted by what we think we know than by our lack of knowledge. I don't know if you can read the bottom part of that. We're blocked with what we already think we know than what we're thinking and than what our knowledge is. We need to be careful about the information we bring and the baggage we bring when we come to study the Bible. It isn't that you have to get rid of it. I'm not saying that. I wouldn't want to get rid of the kinds of things that I've collected. But every time I look at a passage, I need to examine what that passage is saying to the audience in which it was written, the author's mind and what he was thinking about when he wrote it, And then, and only then, should I be making an application to myself. Hermeneutics, as I suggest, is not, get away from the difficult word. It's a science of biblical interpretation, but it basically is bringing, whether hermeneutics of first century writings of any kind, trying to bring it contextually into a modern era. So there's a science about it. There's a methodology about it. And again, we look at it and say, what was the author having to say? What was his audience, if you will? And exegesis is we're drawing out the meaning out of the text. Contrasted, if you will, with an eisegesis, in which we're putting meaning into the text in order to draw out an application. The moment we begin to do that, then we have diminished what the author was trying to say. We have diminished what the audience was receiving in the first century, or later. I keep saying first century because we're going to talk about the New Testament more, but it could well have been into the Old Testament era. For example, there are groups of people that feel that women can't wear any pants, and they get the determination from Deuteronomy 22. And it says right there, women and men should not interchange in pants. But the very next verse, or at least 1, 2 past that, I think that one's in the 4th, and this one might be in the 5th and 6th. The very next verse tells us very adamantly that we're supposed to build racks up above our house, and that's the Hebrew word, to keep people from falling off. Well, how many of us ever do that? In other words, that admonition was written to them for very good reasons. People get on top of their houses, fall off, and then they end up having problems. Today, maybe we'd get sued, so I suppose there's always relevant. Culturally related items to that culture that is not particular to us becomes an issue. I put these slides together at one point that they tend to come at different times, so I got to make certain I get all of it in there. The space between us, whether it's years or culture or terminology or any of those things, are a chasm that we have to build. We have to find a bridge. We have to make an effort to go back and come forward. Oh. So we determine who the author is. In the New Testament, there are a couple texts that we don't know who the authors are. Hebrews comes to mind. We had a 2nd century theologian says, who knows who wrote Hebrews? I can almost guarantee you, though, although tradition has for a long time suggested it was Paul, it isn't Paul. If you look at the 2nd chapter of Hebrews, and you'll find the first few verses, you'll see very much there's something Paul would have never said. And so it probably, and besides, the Greek is a little bit different than Paul, quite a bit different than Paul's. It was probably an Alexandrian kind of training. My best guess, maybe Apollos, but that's only a guess. It could have been almost anyone at that point in time. So we don't always determine who the author is, but we can understand what his audience is, and we can look at the scriptures, and we can have a guess about when it came about, etc. Those are all important things to do that. And you say, well, how am I going to know that, Howard? There's no way that I'm going to go study all the history and etc. I don't even care about history. The way to go about doing that is, first of all, as I said, look at the scriptures multiple times, look at the various translations. A Bible dictionary is of real help in that way, and good commentaries are as well. Those are all methods in which to go about doing that. Getting the intended meaning behind what the author has to say is the only way to be able to study the Bible. So we need to dive into that part of it. A text in it, the author's intent is as discernible from the text as it is from the context. That is, what was the issues around it? If you read 1 Corinthians, Paul is answering a number of questions all the way through the first book of Corinthians. We don't have the questions, we have the answers. We're on the other end of the telephone. And those of you that remember landlines, someone is talking on the other end, and you're talking, and we're standing there next to you, and we're listening to the answers, and we can sometimes pretty well guess what the questions are. That's what you have to do with the book of Corinthians. And I'm going to touch on it, so I won't say much about it. But passages in which Paul is addressing questions, then we look at it and say, well, what was the question that had come out of his answer? That's another way to go about understanding what the context was around this thing. It's a speech act. And the reason for it, and the reason we say that it's a speech act, is because of the nature of how letters were written. They weren't that elaborate. They had to be delivered by somebody. Somebody it was right there when the author was writing them. And they come back and say, here's what the author said. I'm going to read this to you. Oh, you have a question from group as we're reading through this. Okay, well, here's what he had in mind when he was talking about it. Oh, okay, I sort of understand that. You read Corinthians that way, you'll pick it up. And when you get into 2 Corinthians, you'll see some of the other things and the challenges that Paul had. Now, is there anything wrong with contextualization? What do I mean by that? That's a fancy word. Is there anything wrong with me applying what I'm studying in the text to my life today? Absolutely not. That's precisely why we have the Bible, is so that I can understand the application it has to me and the difficulties I'm facing on a day-to-day basis. But if I try to make that contextualization, if I try to make the application before I've gone about the effort of studying what the author was writing, then I'm just guessing as to how I can make the application. I'm just saying, well, that sounds good, so therefore it's good. We can't do that. Otherwise, the Bible becomes everything to anyone, in which is precisely some criticism of it. Okay. Not every command in the Bible was meant for all believers for all time. They aren't. The Bible wasn't written to you in the 21st century. It was written for you. And so all commands that are there, we don't always follow. We don't bring lambs to the offering. Or, if that applies to you, I'm looking at you, Ricardo. I assume that you got. I'm assuming your son's not watching this. Otherwise,
He is now.
There is reasons for that, and I'm not going to dive into the details behind some of these Old Testament passages. There are, and there's some very good reason for it. And I did mention already Deuteronomy 22, but or there's a couple others. 2 kinds of seeds, do not wear clothing, wool and 2 kinds of material. There was some reason behind that. Anybody's really interested, they can pop back a question to me on an email, and I'll do my best to explain it with a minimum amount of verbiage. And then the Sabbath, same issue. Now, don't start in on me and is the Sabbath still going on, etc., etc. This is not a doctrinal presentation. Can I answer that? I think so, but that's not my point here. The point is that not all the commands we find are applicable to us today. But when they were given then, it's for us to learn from them. Here's a good one. Go sell everything you have and give it to the poor. Did they do that? You say, did all the Christians do that? No. How do I know that? 12th chapter of Acts. Mark's mother still had a fairly sizable house that could take in whole groups of people. She obviously didn't sell her house. Just think about that for a minute. Mark, who wrote one of the Gospels, came to the house. This is a story about Peter coming in the 12th chapter of Acts, but you can go look that up. How about this one? Greet one another with a holy kiss. They still do a lot of that in Europe. We're not used to it in the United States. First time it happens, it's a little bit different. But they picked this up from the text, by the way, and they've historically been doing it. We handshake. Well, we don't during the virus, but I mean, typically we do a handshake, or now it's a fist pump or something else, you know. But we get a little closer before I get into some difficult ones. Paul telling Timothy, take that instead of a pill. Well, they didn't have pills, did they, Dr. Richards? So he told them to take some wine. We ignore that one generally. That's not a difficult one we tend to pass along. But how about the second one? 1 Corinthians. Now I'm going to get into where it's a little more difficult. 11th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And look at that passage. It doesn't say anything about her praying or prophesying. It's just an issue of how her head was covered. Now there's a reason for that. And invariably in that culture, having your hair down said, one, that I'm not married, or two, I could even be a prostitute, etc., etc. That's why he said, cover up your head. It was that simple. And we don't need to be applying that aspect of that culture to today. So, could she still pray? Yes. Could she still prophesy? Yes. And today we don't pay a lot of attention whether you're covering your head. Now, there are some groups that still adhere to it. Okay. I'm not going to get into that, but again, it was a cultural-driven issue. Now, again, contextualization is bringing the significance of their context from then and there to here and now. That's what contextualization is. We're trying to attempt to get the meaning out of what was written long ago. And of course, the reason the Bible is, and because it wasn't written to you. So it's a little more difficult to find. But it was written for you. My favorite cartoon. Again, if we're looking for passages in which we can establish our preconceived thought processes, we're going to get into trouble because we're going to pull text out of there. We're not going to have the meaning. We're not going to understand why it was there. And if you do, you start to have problems. How many of you have been to Troas recently to pick up Paul's coat? That doesn't make any sense. That's very culturally related. We ignore that. But we can jump on 2-3, if you will. I already put the rest of those up there, didn't I? Okay. Now it's time to talk about some issues. One of the problems we had with our brotherhood is the issue of females and silence, etc., etc. And we look at verses 34, 35, if you'll look those up. But we ignore verses 1 through 5, We ignore verses 26, 33 and 39, 40. And they have to do with speaking in tongues and prophesying. Let me take just a second to dive into this particular passage a little bit more. This is one of the critical passages within our groups, if you will, our doctrinal groups. The other one's in Timothy. And Timothy has a whole different issue. He had a couple of women that was giving him a lot of problems, and that's why Paul told him to do X, Y, Z with women. But in this passage here, it undoubtedly, now get this, undoubtedly a question asked of Paul rather than Paul giving a dictate to it. And we know that for a lot of reasons, not least of which the context would really say that, but more importantly, some of our oldest manuscripts took those passages out, by the way, those verses, moved them down further into the chapter and put them there so that it didn't look like that it was a question as much as it was an answer, because Paul challenges that question. Don't you have homes to talk about this thing? Why would it even bother you? So think in terms of, I'm listening to the telephone, and the question comes up, I think they ought to be quiet, and etc. No, don't you have a home of it? Look at verse 34, 36. Now, I'm not suggesting that you quickly look at it and come charging back at me with questions. And I know that will happen. Go home, study it in multiple versions, look at Bible dictionaries, even consider a commentary. I'm not negative on commentaries. It's just that you don't want them influencing your thought process while you're reading the text. So you don't really want to listen to another person's opinion until you've had a feel for it yourself. Now, I don't know if that makes more sense, but think about that. And at this point, study it, reread it, read it multiple times, read it within the context, and the context of that chapter goes all the way from chapter 11 all the way through the 14th chapter. That's 11, 12, 13, yes, the love chapter, and the 14th. Paul writes it in there in terms of the power of the Holy Spirit, etc. All those things have meaning. Questions from anybody from the audience, or are they just... Okay, I'm going to go on. And we have some traditional groups, ours isn't one of them, but traditional groups that try to circumvent some of these passages. Hebrews 6, 4 through 6 has to do with falling away, as does the others. And 2 Timothy 4, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, etc. There's a principle up there. The text, and this is important, the text can never mean more to us than it did to the first century recipients. If you don't take that as a principle, then you're developing your application without what they... In other words, you can't look at them and say, well, I'll just ignore that. Whatever it meant to them, I'm going to have an application because it sounds good. It has meaning. Text can never mean more to us than it did the first century recipients, no matter how well it sounds. So when you're studying, that's a key aspect. Well, it's time. Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 writes this verse. There's groups, I think we're certainly included, in which we talk about the abilities in terms of the supernatural relationship with the Holy Spirit. There's a lot of answers to that, but it isn't in the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians and 10th verse. It just is not there. When the perfect comes, the partial will be done away with. The exegesis and the studying of it, we're not in, I can give you some good guesses. We don't always know what that passage means, but it does help to set limits as to what it cannot mean. And why can it mean that to the 1 Corinthians? Paul writes the 1 Corinthians AD 54 as a number. There were very few texts written in terms of the New Testament at that point in time. More importantly, the Corinthians had no way of knowing that there was going to be additional texts. And he would not have ever written something that had meaning to those people that they didn't have any understanding. If I write you a letter, if I email you a letter, text it even, I can do that. It has to have some meaning for me, and I think it's going to have some meaning to you unless I get automatic spelling on it and it messes things up. But I'm anticipating you to understand it if I send it to you. Paul sent a letter, and remember how he sent it. He sent it with a messenger. He says, take this letter, and if you'll read 1 Corinthians, you'll find out who brought the letter and all that. I won't go into those details. But he sent that letter to him with an understanding that there was value to that person when he sent it. And I can assure you that they had no thought in their mind whatsoever of a whole group of books being put together a gazillion years later, in some cases, well, not a gazillion, not that far, but a lot of years later, in which it would be collected together in terms and called the New Testament. So therefore, he had to be talking about something else. And if that makes, well, I'm not really asking if it makes sense to you. I want you to go home and study it. I'm not asking you necessarily to agree with me, but understand that it cannot be extended than what the audience was receiving.
Back to that, why did that develop? I realize there's a number of different Christian groups that accept that understanding or promote that understanding. And what historical present-day context did they decide to exegesis? Yeah, Dr. Richard has asked the question, why did we get into accepting that 1 Corinthians 13:10 has to do with Paul talking, basically what the argument is within our own brotherhood among others, is that when that which is perfect comes along, when the rest of the New Testament comes along, we don't really need the supernatural powers of the Holy Spirit. That's basically the argument. There's a lot of answers to that, but one of them isn't 1 Corinthians 13:10, because they would have had no idea what he was talking about and no relevance in which they would have died long before the New Testament print. The reason that some of that was developed is because, and it happened very early on. It's not a 19th, 20th, 21st century development. It happened very early on because in the 2nd century, they no longer had some of the supernatural power things, and that the Holy Spirit was giving them the gift of healing, the gift of a number of other things that the Holy Spirit gave them in the first part, and they want to know why. Is there something wrong with my spirituality? Am I failing God? And therefore, I need an answer for that because I don't have that power. And neither does anyone else around me. And they didn't have. So, in effect, they started looking for specific scriptures that could justify their analysis. It said, my spirituality isn't any less. I don't really need it. I wasn't supposed to have it. And I'll pull this context out of 1 Corinthians 13:10. Does that answer your question, comment? I figured you knew the answer already, Dr. Richard, but anyway, I answered it that way. Thank you.
Again, we cannot pour scripture out justifying our preconceived notions.
We can't do that and study effectively. Now, let's see. Now, only with the exegesis done do we have confidence that our particular situations can be applied. Can we extend the principle in which we're finding in the letters to something that applies to me? And the answer is yes, but only after we've done the exegesis that goes with it. And wherever those situations and particulars are comparable, then as the first century hearers receiving the word, then it does apply to me, and it is directly applicable. Otherwise, why do an exegesis at all? Why do the studying at all? If it's not going to change me, change my attitudes toward the world around me and the people that I'm being involved with, what good is the text? So we can't just stop at an exegesis. We can't just stop at trying to figure out then and there without making a contextualization, without making an application to our lives, without making changes in our lives. Romans 12, be you transformed. I tell you, I've heard this one used a number of times when I was in ministry. Well, I really like this person, but I don't think I can get married to him because they don't believe in God. That's not what this passage is about. It has no, go back and look at the details off of it. It has to do with idol worshiping and etc. In other words, you don't have a combination. I'm not talking about marriage now. You don't have a combination on understanding with somebody that's an idol worshiper and yourself. You can talk to the idol worshiper, but you don't have a combination. You're not communicating. Paul says you've got nothing to talk about with them. You've got any issues. You're separated from them. It is not marriage. He's not talking about marriage here. Now, those of you out there in the audience or whatever said, well, Howard, I'm not sure I agree with you. Okay, that's fine with me. Go back and make a study of those scriptures and see if it doesn't change your mind. Use multiple texts to do that. Where have you been? Church school. We've been studying the letters of the Apostle Paul. That should be interesting. It is. Although I must admit, it makes me feel a little guilty. Why? I always feel like I'm reading someone else's mail. We are. We're reading someone else's mail. And we have to understand what it means to them, what it meant to them, what it can mean to us. We can't shortcut the study. You say, well, I just thought I could just read the Bible and just go through it and everything would be explained to me. Most of the scripture falls in that kind of category. I'm not suggesting you can't. But when you run into difficult passages and the conflict that some theologians have had versus other theologians, you need to settle that for yourself. Don't rely on any other than you reading it yourself. And don't bring the baggage with you when you look at the study. In other words, what my grandfather told me, or in my case, what my father tried to tell me about a passage, doesn't mean as much as me reading it and seeing what the Lord is trying to tell me. Or, if you don't believe in God, I can address that aspect of it. Don't rely on what everyone else has told you it meant. Go back and study it yourself. Don't shortcut the effort of studying, that is, figure out what was then and there and the here and now. Yes, Doctor.
I think part of the problem is you can is that when we have a difference in opinion and we shut people out or say they're totally wrong, or in other words, we when it's not really clear, we need to give people benefit of the doubt or something on some of these passages, and not what am I trying to say?
Well, let me see if I can reword your question a little bit. What the doctor is suggesting is we tend to minimize what someone has said based on the fact that we feel like we probably have more of the right answer. And we treat people that's challenging themselves, perhaps yourself, the teacher as well, and we subjugate them to a, well, you're really wrong, and therefore here's the right answer. That is not what the scriptures are all about. And I don't have all the right answers. You can call me, and I'll give you an answer on the text. That doesn't mean that it's entirely the right answer, because I'm still studying, I'm still learning, I'm still attempting to find that right answer. It is not always obvious. There are several passages that are extraordinarily difficult. Matthew 24 comes to mind. Jesus gives answers to his disciples. They ask 3 questions. He answers them in reverse. And boy, did we ever jump on that, because we're talking about how the future is going to be held, and that's how we look at it. But he answers it in reverse. Take that out of context in which he's answered, and you'll have a mess on your hands when you're trying to understand that passage. And we do. That doesn't mean that I have all the right answers. I'm just suggesting that a methodology in which to go about studying it. And Hebrews 6, verses 4 through 6 that I had up there earlier. That's an extraordinarily difficult passage. Revelation 12 is an extraordinarily difficult passage. I'll try to touch on that if I have enough time in lectures on the whole book of Revelation. But that's a difficult passage. 1 Corinthians 15, I think it's 38, in which they were baptizing for the dead. That's a difficult question. We'll find those passages. But I should quickly suggest to you that none of those issues should reflect on your relationship to God, should change your attitude that I'm a following of God. Those kinds of issues that we find in the text, and there are some of those, that we don't have all the answers for, it does not dictate that we should just throw out God's whole plan. It doesn't suggest that we have to have all those answers or nothing at all. It's not necessary. It's interesting, and I love to dive into the details of it, but it isn't crucial in my relationship to God or to one another. But don't make the application until you make the study. I've got a bunch of cartoons here. Wow. What a mess. I probably should pass over these. They're kind of cute, but we don't have time for them. Well, I've been saying this all along. We must understand the original meaning of the original author intended before we can make a correct application to us today. An application without studying is not effective. It just isn't. Hebrew writers tells us the effect of the Bible, those of you who don't believe in God, the effect of the Bible will change your lives. Now, I honestly believe that's because God has inspired it. And I'll be happy to have that discussion in terms of the reality of God. But the text itself, you can grab a hold of it and say, it'll change your life. And if you don't believe me, look at the whole history of humanity in relationship to the Bible. We've had authors after authors after authors seeing the change. And when we haven't followed some of those steps in the text, we find societies fail.
Right.
So it isn't just a matter of, and I think it has a great deal to do with God, but again, you can have your life transformed if you read the text effectively without having carried God with it. And if you keep reading, I think you'll find God. My personal opinion. Yeah. Ricardo, you can go home and beat on your son. Should we stone rebellious children? No. Deuteronomy? Silence in the church? Etc. Women. It's an issue. It's an issue today. It's within the conservative evangelical groups. It's an issue. I'm not suggesting it isn't, and I'm not advocating that we make dramatic changes. I'm suggesting that that particular passage that we dwell so much on, 1 Corinthians 14, 35, 36, is not the application that we tend to make it. It isn't there. It's not there in the original manuscripts, and it isn't there in terms of where we're at. Does it follow some 2 Timothy or 1 Timothy another issue? Yes, it is. And that has to be addressed. There's one of the most critical, I'm almost done, most critical problems that we have in looking at the text is that we're looking for magic answers. And what do I mean by that? Am I going to be wealthy? Am I going to be healthy? Should I make a move? But he said, I must proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God to other towns also. Because of that, that's why I was sent. What about this one? She went east and west, but look upon Zion, a tent that will not be moved. What if you were making an application to yourself when you read that first verse, and this person was, that she should get packed up and go? Now, Ruth thought that that's what I did because we moved 30 some odd times in our 50-plus years of marriage, but it was a different reason. Usually money was driving it. We looked at the first passage and said, yeah, that's what I need to do. God's finally answered. It's not a magic answer. The story is not about you or about me. It's about God. And you say, well, I don't believe in God. Okay. The story that the author had in mind when they wrote the passage was about God. And those he was writing to was about God. And so they did believe in God, and therefore here's what he told them. Does that make sense to you? We should not be looking for magic answers out of the text. It's not there. And every time I hear someone start predicting the end of the world, I chuckle. And I do that because they're looking at the text, usually Matthew 24, by the way. They look at the text and make an interpretation that just is not applicable. Maybe they sell books. They sell movie rights, but it's not what the Bible has to say.
I think, however, one might be an exception. It's Proverbs. I think there's some things that you could directly apply in Proverbs.
Or Ecclesiastes. Everything that means nothing. What was he talking about? He didn't mean everything didn't mean nothing. He'd gone through a lot of study and effort. But anyway. It doesn't speak through random verses taken out of context. The Bible just doesn't do that. And if you're doing that with a text, favorite text, even a favorite book, Romans comes to mind for myself. I had some fantastic professors in the book of Romans. And John, the Gospel of John, Dr. Weed comes to my mind. That doesn't mean that I ought to be pulling passages out of context with that. Or, here they go. I guess the last one, I didn't put that. The Bible doesn't speak through random verses taken out of context. They raised, now this is really great. They raised their voices, they shout for joy from the west. They acclaim the Lord's majesty. Isaiah 24:14. Therefore in the east, give glory to the Lord, exalt the name of the Lord, the God of Israel in the islands of the sea. Isaiah 24:15. A verse later. You understand what I'm trying to attempt here? You cannot take a passage out of context. Now that Isaiah had something to be said for that, and he was trying to make a point, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details on that. If you're truly interested, rattle my cage and I'll try to explain it.
Some people sent missionaries to the Micronesia because of that particular verse.
But they forgot the very next verse. I'm out of time, I guess. We'll continue this study, and I'll have some more to say about some of the letters. I do want to get into the Old Testament and address some of the issues, because the way various genre, if you will, the various methodology in which we have the authors talking about, makes a big difference as to what they were discussing. And Zechariah comes to my mind. Certainly major portions of Daniel come to my mind to do that, as well as the more legalistic aspect of Leviticus and Genesis and etc. And they have meaning. When we read that text, we tend to skip over Leviticus, especially Leviticus, because it's a pain, But it has so much meaning to it. But it has to be read then and there